Welcome to the Department of Psychiatry and CPFT lunchtime seminar. The speaker today is Professor Anna Alexandrova, and the title of her talk is Wellbeing and Mental Health, What is the Right Relationship? Thank you, Anna, for coming. So Anna is a professor in philosophy of science here at the University of Cambridge and a fellow of King's College, Cambridge as well. She researches how formal tools such as models and indicators enable scientists to navigate complex phenomena tinged with ethical and political dimensions. Her book, A Philosophy for the Science of Wellbeing, came out with Oxford University Press in 2017 and won the 2022 Gittler Book Prize for the American Philosophical Association. So, Anna, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Julieta, and thank you, colleagues, for having me. Let me share my slides. Right, so this is joint work with Sam Wren-Lewis, and we have already published this paper, but I'll try to expand on what's happening in it. Look, I'm talking today about definitions of mental health. I'm not talking about causes and risk factors of mental health and preconditions for it. That's something that you know about. I'm talking about the very starting point of any kind of empirical inquiry, that is the definitions. When I've been looking at the world of subjective well-being sciences for the past 20 years or so. And then when I try to, it's pretty clear, I have a pretty clear view of how well-being is defined across many different medical and empirical research contexts. But I tried to do the same for mental health, and it was really hard to figure out how is it that colleagues across social and medical sciences actually defined well-being, mental health. Here's what I found. I found two definitions that fall, in my view, on extreme ends of things. And they, amazingly enough, they coexist. So on the one hand, you have a definition that is very bare and very simple. That is, mental health is just the absence of diagnosable mental illness. It is a purely descriptive definition in that you have mental health if you just meet that descriptive standard of not having a diagnosable condition. And it's a purely negative one because, yeah, mental health is just what's called the silence of your organs, right? There is nothing positive, there is nothing in addition to not having a mental illness. It's very common to encounter this definition when you see, various public pronouncements about the importance of parity between mental and physical health, because often enough, the only thing people mean by saying we need to consider people's mental health is we need to throw resources at relief of mental illness, right? So when this is a situation in which people implicitly operate with this minimal negative definition. However, it's quite difficult to find anyone who explicitly agrees to defend it, like properly. There is, you might know more, but there's only one person that I know has kind of published an explicit defense of how there shouldn't be anything more to mental health than the absence of mental illness. And that is Christopher Boorse, in a very eminent philosopher of science, who is very well known for his definition of health in general, but also has a definition of mental health. And this 1976 paper, what a theory of mental health should be, and there hasn't been much, no one since then who has tried to defend the same minimalist position. But I'll tell you how he does it. But first, I want to introduce the other extreme for you. Mental health as a complete state of well-being which is a diametrically opposed definition. It is both evaluative, because it tells us that mental health is something good for us, and positive. It's something more than just absence of a mental illness. So here's World Health Organization: a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. So now that I've introduced these two extremes, you probably have experience of other definitions of mental health that probably fall somewhere on in between these two. But I think it is fair enough to start by figuring out exactly why both extremes are very, very bad as definitions of mental health. Well, I don't know, it's very, very bad, but it's not good. So let me tell you about health as absence of disease, Boorse. So here is Boorse's definition of health, and then he extends it to mental health. An organism is healthy at any moment in proportion as it is not diseased, so that's the negative part. And a disease is a type of internal state of the organism which, one, interferes with the performance of some natural function, i.e. some species typical contribution to survival and reproduction, characteristic of the organism's age, and is not simply in the nature of species, i.e. is either atypical of the species or, if typical, mainly due to environmental causes. Quite a lot of work goes into unpacking these conditions, but very roughly, the idea is that if you define a set of functions that various organs and the organism has, and if those functions are judged relative to their contribution to survival and reproduction, relative to the organism's age, then just, you know, whenever these functions, these functions are not performed in a statistically normal way, then we have disease. So this is called the biostatistical theory for the obvious reasons, because it indexes health to biological facts and statistical facts, right? It has to be worse than a normal for your kind of group. And here is how Boorse wants to extend it to mental health in this paper. For mental health, the extension he thinks is quite straightforward. You just have to define a set of mental functions, and that in the same way as the function of the heart is to pump blood, then you would have the same. You would have to define the same set of function for what? Well, for creatures. Mental organs. Which ones would that be? Well, brains, basically, right? So let me just unpack a little bit more this definition. As you see, it is purely descriptive and value-free conception of health. And he's very explicit that we need this technical definition of health for physiology. And it's true that in clinical medicine, we would probably need a different definition. So you want to separate the normative questions about, you know, what we should treat and how individuals ought to function with the descriptive questions of what conditions, how their body is functioning. So he draws a strong distinction between disease and illness. Something can be a disease without being an illness. So something can be a disease without you needing to be treated, warranting medical attention. So famously and controversially, under Boorse's definition, you could see how he's writing in the 70s, just as homosexuality is being removed from the DSM-3 as a condition. And he says, well, on my purely descriptive definition of health, homosexuality might be count as disease, but it shouldn't be called an illness because it doesn't warrant medical attention. That was his way of squaring the circle. But you know, these sort of uncomfortable and weird implications shouldn't take away from the fact that he's trying to do something quite worthwhile. He's trying to divorce judgments about what is good for an individual from judgments about what is health. And there's something good to that idea. So here's a quote: "The trouble with calling physical or mental or moral excellence health is that it tends to unite under one value-neutral notion, health, freedom from disease, with the most controversial of all prescription, the recipe for an ideal human being." So Boorse is trying to formulate a value-free basis for physiology, which you might think is not such a bad thing, even if you grant that, you know, in clinical contexts, you're going to need to adopt a different concept. So, okay, what are going to be those mental functions? He has very little to say, and nothing that would be perhaps of interest to a modern psychiatrist. You know, he thinks that the best current theory for the mental function would be the psychoanalytic theory, which is so ironic that, you know, he's writing in the 70s, just as DSM-3 is purging the language of psychoanalysis from its diagnostic tools. So, and he says how, you know, you could basically define a set of mental functions via the psychoanalytic route. You could read about it, but it's I think it's truly only of historical interest. Okay, so let's just summarize reasons to reject Boorse's type definition for mental health. First, we don't have an account of evolved mental functions that should operate and how and at what level and relative to which environment for a person to count as mentally healthy. There just isn't such a, like, what level of anxiety contributes to reproduction and survival in my age group. Well, in what kind of environment and partitioned how exactly, it's just, I don't see it. You tell me whether I'm wrong, but I don't see any a theory of mental function that could play the role that Boorse wanted to play. The other problem is that mental health is very much an action guiding, not only a descriptive concept. So it is, Boorse was just plainly wrong to say that it is possible to have a purely value-free definition of disease, and therefore purely value-free definition of health wouldn't work either, because I think it is well known that DSM definitions of disorders are also laden with normative assumptions about what counts as normal functioning and at what level, and what counts as contributing to the misery of the patients, and so on. And the problem then with the value judgments is not that they're there, it's rather they're very poor value judgments, that they might be very oppressive, cruel, stigmatizing, but it's not the fact that they're value judgment that is the problem, it's what kind of value judgments they are. So I therefore reject Boorse's search for a value-free definition of health. I also think it is worth asking that shouldn't there be something more to health, mental or otherwise, than just silence of the organs? Wouldn't we want a positive definition to some extent? So this is why the first extreme is not working. What about the second one? So let me just remind you the most ambitious definitions. Yeah, so here's the World Health Organization one on the left, which I've already read. On the right, you have the totality of individuals' cognitive and emotional resources and dynamic state in which the individual is able to develop their potential, work productively, build positive relationship, and contribute to their community. That's the Foresight report on so-called mental capital for the government. So I don't think it is just World Health Organization and some ambitious reports. I mean, there is a long history of people trying to offer a demanding positive definition of mental health. So I was really interested to find out about this British sociologist and psychologist, Marie Yahoda, working in the 50s, who put together back then a report of the current concepts of mental health that continues to be cited very widely. And she just tried to figure out what is it, what are the ingredients that people put into beyond mere absence of disease. And she's uncovered that it could be self-acceptance, self-confidence, self-actualization, integration of different psychological functions, autonomy, accurate perception of reality, environmental mastery, all sorts of things like that. Yeah, so what's wrong with that? That's far too ambitious. Who doesn't realize their full potential? Who doesn't work productively? Who doesn't contribute to their community? I think that's most of us. And I think these definitions from WHO or others, I have no idea why they had to be phrased so grandly. And where, I mean, did the authors not realize that that basically medicalizes the rest of us, right? And you might think that it's a good thing for definitions to be aspirational, but not always. I think in this case, there's a great possibility of this definition being deeply oppressive, of setting out the ideal human life and saying that if you don't meet that life, you're not mentally healthy. Yeah, I find that just, I mean, I'd like to be explained why people are moved to adopt such grandiose definitions. So here's another version of it that I see arising now. It's not quite as ambitious as functioning at your highest level, but it's mental health as subjective well-being. So let me tell you about that. I think the ideal that to be mentally healthy, you have to have high subjective well-being or subjective well-being at a certain level is an implicit idea in lots of initiatives, namely the IAPT, right, Increasing Access to Psychological Therapy in the UK. It's a program that makes cognitive behavioral therapy widely available on the grounds that cognitive behavioral therapy is the best way of promoting subjective well-being and reducing misery. So in many of these cases, to get people up to mental health, we need to get them up to a decently high level of subjective well-being. I'll just show you some slides about it. So this is, for example, one of those, many of those grey papers, 5 Ways to Well-being, that got picked up by various health authorities. Yeah, there are 5 ways, 5 things you need to do: connect, be active, take notice, keep learning, give. And there's all sorts of evidence that's, well, sometimes quite shoddy evidence that is put forward to justify this. But these are 5 ways to well-being and to mental health, right? So there are quite a lot of people who think this is a disaster and you shouldn't do that. Namely, our former Chief Medical Officer, Sally Davis, in her 2013 report, was quite scathing. After reviewing the evidence, I conclude that well-being does not have sufficiently robust evidence-based commensurate with the level of attention and funding it currently receives in public mental health at national and government level. Well-being as a field within mental health has not evidenced an acceptable definition or a set of metrics. It is unclear how concepts and measures that do exist relate to populations with mental illnesses. So I think she's very much right to call out this kind of shoddy identification of well-being with mental health. But I don't like the implication that we have very good and robust metrics and evidence when it comes to treating mental health as absence of disease, but we don't on the well-being side. I don't think the asymmetry is quite as sharp as she wants to say. But what's really wrong with identifying mental health with subjective well-being is just simply that it medicalizes unhappiness. And in that way, it very much oversteps the bounds of medicine and healthcare. So, and kind of the sort of misery that I have plunged into in the last week and expect to be in for the foreseeable future. I think there is no reason to conceptualize it as a mental illness, or at least not necessarily. And very easily, these initiatives make the slide. Yeah, this idea that positive mental health, especially when it's identified with well-being, is a dangerous step for psychiatry to take, is not just me. So I was influenced by writings of another fellow philosopher from New Zealand, Simon Keller, who talks about how the positive conception of mental health is dangerous because it takes the concept of health, which we usually treat as objective and scientific, and applies it to questions of how we should think and how we should live. And medicine just doesn't have the authority to tell us about that. Okay, so let's just take stock. A negative definition struggles with articulating functions and lacks the advantages that Boorse thinks it has. And existing positive definitions are overly ambitious or oppressive, or they medicalize unhappiness that is completely warranted given the state of the world. So is there an option in the middle? Yes, there is. It's important to articulate it clearly. When I began searching for this notion, I read a lot of existing definitions of mental health. And my experience was really frustrating. So here's, for instance, the Public Health Agency of Canada. The capacities of each and all of us to feel, think, and act in ways that enhance our ability to enjoy life and deal with the challenges we face. It is a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects the importance of culture, equity, social justice, interconnection, and personal dignity. I was thinking, wow, first sentence, great. Why did it have to go into the second sentence? Why, in addition to capacities to think and feel, we also need to say that you're not mentally healthy unless you have a positive sense of emotional and spiritual well-being that respects all of those great things, right? Why not stop at the first sentence? In particular, if we defined mental health as the psychological preconditions for well-being, i.e. those psychic skills that, if developed and possessed, enable people to pursue good lives, whatever those lives end up being, then the idea is you define mental health as in terms of capacities for acquiring well-being, however you decide to do that, but not well-being itself. So on that basis, we've put together this very rough proposal about how the outlines that we would like to see in a theory of mental health. If the positive definition is too demanding and the negative and not demanding enough, the most plausible one would be somewhere in between. It would still be evaluative rather than purely descriptive, because I don't believe it is possible to define either disease or capacities, psychological capacities in a purely descriptive way. However, it would be somewhat positive, not just the absence of mental health, and it would be in terms of these preconditions for well-being rather than well-being proper. When we try to put our finger on it, here's where we had mental health consists in the possession of the capacities to feel, think, and act in ways that enable us to pursue, to value and engage in life. And we cash it out a little bit, but of course it needs a much better, a much more detailed cashing out if this were a promising definition. So we'd like to pick out psychological rather than physiological or social factors that enable, that give us the capacity to feel. So, and this is not to say that physiological and social factors are not important for mental health. Of course they are. It's just that they shouldn't be part of the definition of mental health. It should be that they are the contributors to mental health, but it is not, it shouldn't be the case that to be mentally healthy, you need to be in a to count as being mentally healthy, you need to be in a particularly healthy social environment. No, social environment can be a contributor to your mental health without being the same, right? Importantly, we do not require to actually enjoy life, only to have the capacity to value it, and that's a different thing. And we would like to preserve some neutrality by comparison to the more ambitious definition, in that I think it is possible for a definition of mental health to be compatible with radically different conceptions of good life. And a definition of mental health shouldn't be a definition of a good life. That would be violating neutrality, and that would be taking psychiatry and public health research outside the area of authority, in my view. I have some unpacking and that I could tell you about these capacities, but I still think that the key empirical question, which I'm not answering as a philosopher, is that is there a single set of universal psychological capacities for well-being, or are they inevitably environment relative? And if they are inevitably environment relative, then we're going to have different definitions of mental health for different environments. So finally, what could possibly measure it, this capacities thing? I don't know. I mean, I haven't tried to develop a scale for capacities for well-being rather than well-being proper. There are lots and lots of scales of well-being. But when I look at the Warwick and Edinburgh scale of mental well-being science, which is a very, very widely used tool, at least in the UK, and I see the statements, feeling useful, feeling relaxed, feeling interested in other people, energy to spare, thinking clearly. See, there's only feeling good about myself, a feeling cheerful that corresponds to subjective well-being. All the other items are very much trying to grab onto this capacity for well-being, the ability to get it rather than well-being itself. So I think Warwick and Edinburgh scale probably is in the spirit of what we're doing. And I think it's really important to realize how different this proposal is from either the purely negative or the super ambitious definitions of mental health. So I think I'm going to stop here. There are lots and lots of open questions left. What interventions supports mental health and how it should be measured. These are all great empirical questions that I do not answer, but I think it is, I think we can discuss how having different, depending on what definition of mental health you adopt, how that changes your answers to these causal and measurement questions. I think it does change. So, and I would love to hear your views on that. I really appreciate you having me.
Excellent. Thanks very much.